Shalom, and it's a zchut to learn together the last chapter of Mishnayot Mesechet Sota Li'iloi Nishmat Rabadin ben Avraham Moshe Zecher Tzadik Lebracha. We're going to be focusing not only on the basic themes of this chapter, but how they also dovetail with the other chapters of the Mishnayot of this Mesechet. Interestingly, when looking at the other chapters, we notice that only the first four and the sixth chapter of Mishnah Sota actually discuss the topic of the tractate's title, while the other four chapters, 5 and 7, 8, and 9, contain lengthy digressions. The first Mishnah of chapter 5, for example, discusses a lot that the suspected adulteress, the Isha Sota, is forbidden to the suspected adulterer as well as to her husband, presenting Rabbi Akiva's biblical derivation, which is praised by his teacher Rabbi Yoshua. This is then followed by several other hermeneutical innovations presented bo bayom by Rabbi Akiva and his Talmud Rabbi Yoshua ben Hyrkonos. So interestingly, we have various words, literary devices that we're familiar with from other Masechtot in Shas as well that help us understand a little bit of the sequence of these Mishnayot that once upon a time were Ba'al Peh. Similarly, chapter 7 of Mesechet Sota opens its list of recitations, which the halacha allows in any language with the Sota passage, with the same parsha of the Sota, the text of the oath, which the Sota is required to affirm before she drinks the bitter water. So after listing this parsha, this segment of the Torah that has to be said, B'Loshan HaKodesh, then there's a listing of an additional 6 pronouncements which may be recited in any language. The Mishnah then lists 8 recitations which may be performed only in the Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, followed by 3 chapters in which each recitation is going to be presented, several of them, in fact, in great detail. Of the many common terms and themes that link chapters 7, 8, and 9 to chapters 1 to 6, the most striking is actually in our chapter, in chapter 9, in the first section of Perek Tet, which discusses the Egla Arufa, the broken-necked heifer, which is going to be a ceremony in a case of murder wherein we don't know which city, in fact, is culpable for the murder itself. Both this unit and the Sota unit are going to serve then as the basis and the outline of the entire Mesechet. They both conclude, meaning chapters 1 to 6, and again chapter 9, conclude with a reliability of a single witness to the crime, man or woman, to cancel the ceremony, followed by a series of cases exploring different scenarios in which the testimony to the crime is contradicted by witnesses of greater or less halachic standing. But what we're going to focus on, in fact, are further parallels between our chapter, Perek Tet, the chapter of Egla Rufa, which doesn't at first glance seem to have much to do with the Isha Sota chapters of Mesechet Sota, and see how, in fact, Perek Tet, Egla Rufa is very much going to be seen as a parallel to the laws of Isha Sota, helping us appreciate why it is the concluding chapter of this Mesechet. So I'm going to share with you a page of various parallels. I want to thank Rabbi Abby Wolfish, who composed basically a beautiful article on listing the various associations. And I'm going to build off of that a little together with you as we learn these Mishnayot, paying attention both to literary devices and, as mentioned, thematic ideas that are going to come across as we learn this together. So let's begin with various literary parallel with, this is the last of the pages. Let's start off with the common terms and themes that link chapters 7, 8, and 9, and particularly 9, to chapters 1 to 6. As we said, the most striking repetitions occur in the first section of chapter 9. We see that both this unit, meaning chapter 9, and the Sota unit, which we discuss as really chapters 1 to 6, conclude with the reliability of the single witness. Either a man or a woman can cancel the entire ceremony if there's a witness. We only need the ceremony in the case where there still is doubt. So that's parallel number 1. There's also, interestingly, in both of these ceremonies, the involvement of priests, starting with the Mishnah in Perek Aleph, wherein the entire Sota ceremony is performed by a priest, by a Kohen, while the Egla Rufa ceremony concludes with the Kohanim, the priest's prayer for kapara, for atonement. We also have the involvement of the Zakinim, the local court, what we call the basic Beit Din of a city, and the Beit Din Hagadol in Yerushalayim. Both of these ceremonies are also going to involve the High Court. And in addition, what to do with the materials that are consecrated for the ceremony, and with the suspect if relevant developments occur before or after a crucial stage in trying to clarify what the crime in fact was or is. Both ceremonies also involve water. The Mei Marim, also known as the Mei Marim Hama'arim, the bitter cursed waters that the Sota eventually drinks, and the Egla Rufa ceremony of our chapter 9, which takes place by a Nachal Eitan, by a very strong river. Interestingly, both not your typical waters, something very unique about these waters. The ceremony also concludes with a divine affirmation. In the case of the Isha Sota, the adulteress's punishment, as we find in the first perek, and the biblical promise of atonement, which we also see in our perek of Egla Rufa. We see a divine affirmation that are both attributed to Ruach HaKodesh, to a divine spirit, who ultimately, in both cases, clarifies certain ambiguities. So we have divine affirmation, basically kapara provided by Ruach HaKodesh. The case of the tractate, a list of practices and blessings that were abolished as a result of the Chorban Bayit Sheni, the destruction of the Second Temple and its aftermath, opening with an epilogue to the Egla Arufa and the Sota ceremonies. Notice the terminology. Misha Rabu Haratzchanim Batla Egla Arufa. Once there were so many murderers, then there wasn't really any reason to perform the Egla Rufa ceremony, which focused on the consequences of murder, even a murder of a city which we're not in fact 100% sure is culpable of the crime. And the same terminology at the end of the Mishnayot, we hear Misha Rabu Hanoafim Pasku Hamayim Hamarim, that we also Hamayim Hamarim, that when there was so much adultery, when adultery was rampant during the time period of the second Beit HaMikdash, we also find that the ceremony of the Isha Sota, this divine ceremony, was no longer effective as well. So both of these are mentioned together. Our chapter brings then the case of the Isha Sota into the ceremony of the Egla Arufa. And before we start to examine why, let's appreciate some other parallels, particularly terms, themes that we find mentioned both throughout the Mishnayot and particularly in Perek Tet, dealing with the laws of Egla Arufa that focus much more on issues of murder. So as we look then, we see that there are major themes here that are going to be discussed. One can argue that the basic idea then is certainly, as we look at the end of the Mishnayot of Masechet Sota, teach us then through the lists and the practices of the blessings that were abolished as a result of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, that many of these include the abolishment of certain wedding practices and customs that serve then as a perfect epilogue to Masechet Sota, whose major theme is protecting the institution of marriage from suspected adultery. So what a beautiful end to the Mishnah, wherein the entire Masechet, albeit, is going to end with the laws of Egla Arufa, but at the same time remind us of the most sacred institution of marriage, which is what Isha Sota is all about. And that's why the last Mishnayot discuss both. Again, I would argue even a cherry on top, this specific equation, which highlights all of the above parallels, teach us that the comparable features of these two ceremonies of Egla Arufa and Isha Sota is really one of the pedagogical goals of the entire Masechet, teaching us the sacred nature of marriage, teaching us about these two ceremonies. Both ceremonies address the common problem, a serious, one can even say, and a terrible crime, the crime of murder and the crime of adultery, with potential to undermine the moral underpinnings of society. In both cases, punishments of the offender cannot be executed because of doubt. So with regarding the Isha Sota, the doubt whether the Sota, the wayward woman, is guilty of actual adultery or only of serious sexually fraught indiscretion and promiscuity is resolved by a divinely supervised ordeal, as it was always known, one that was an examination, a divine examination with miraculous results. The Egla Rufa of Periktet does not necessarily assuage or even resolve the doubts of guilt, but rather atones for the society which has failed in its responsibility to prevent murderers or avenge them. And this is what we see as we continue here with the basic themes then of the Sota and Egla Arufa. And we're going to focus now on these themes as manifest through various ideas of measurement. So let's look now at our last chapter of Perek Tet of Mesachet Sota that links the entire tractate together through these themes of measurement. The first chapter, as we see in Perek Aleph, Mishnah Zayin, and as you're looking on the left-hand column, we see over and over again the idea of measuring, whether it's b'midah she'adam moded ba modedin lo, לפיכך נתלה אבשלום בשערו, במידה שאדם מודד בה. Notice this terminology of figurative measurements characterizing divine justice, midah keneged midah. The same way that man measures or calculates his actions, that's how God ultimately is going to measure, is going to compensate. Similarly, as we look then not only at Perek Tet, which will end also with the repetition of this theme of modedin, measuring, we also see right in the middle of our tractate, Perek He, Mishnah Gimel, smack in the middle, we have another theme of measurement. Umidatam michutz la'ir. This is referring to the measurement for restricting Shabbat travel to 2,000 cubits outside the city, which basically finds its mirror image also in Perek Tet with regard to the Egla Rufa. Ein modedin, me'ayin hayu modedin, the measurement towards the city from the location outside the city where the corpse was found. And what we see then is that the Mishnah is connecting the literal measurement of or to the city nearest to the corpse with a figurative measuring meted out by divine justice that brings us back to the first chapter, to the chapter introducing the Isha Sota. So these three Mishnayot, at the beginning of the Mesachet, in the middle of the Mesachet, and again at the end of the Mesachet, in Perek Tet, seemingly digress as they're located in the first, the middle, and the last chapters of the tractate, but they're actually going to link the entire Mesachet together through this theme of measurement. Let's look then at the first measurement. This, we said, is one of divine justice, b'midah she'adam modedin bo, limited to counterimpose the measurements, really, of humans, as opposed to man, who can always compensate or judge or even punish in a requisite fashion. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does exacting punishment. So the measurements of the court that we find in chapter 5 and in chapter 9 around the city, the hub of human habitation, are contrasted already at the beginning of the Mesachet to the court system of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the divine justice. Both the Sota and the Egla Rufa ceremonies manifest the shortcomings of human agencies of justice. In both cases, the procedure requires the local court, the Zakanim within the city, and the high court, the Beit Din Hagadol B'Yushalayim. The local court determines based on witnesses to kinoi, the admonishment, and the stira, the seclusion, which are the grounds for suspicion of adultery in the absence of testimony to the crime itself. Then the Zakanim send parties to the Beit Din Hagadol, to the high court, who are the ones to authorize the beginnings of the divine ordeal. Similarly, in our chapter, in the case of Egla Rufa, justice cannot be executed upon the unknown perpetrator in the case of an undoubted crime, but the high court, the Beit Din Hagadol, determines which local court, whether it's the closer city, the farther city, must entreat Hashem, must entreat God for atonement. These two models of human agencies of justice are unable to discharge their duty. Namely, they need to rely also on on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So they try, in as much as possible, to deal with justice on their own, but they also need the Kohanim to be present in both of these ceremonies. The Kohanim, who serve as representatives of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who ultimately are also going to present the case. Rava Avi Wolfish, and I want to thank him for writing a magnificent article to point out all these various parallels. He creatively proposes that this literary tapestry presents an idea that resonates throughout Masechet Sotah, the boundaries and interaction of human and divine justice. These crimes that outline the entire Masechet, beginning with adultery, ending with murder, are characterized from the entire bookends. They're characterized by secrecy. And that's why, as we began, a single witness to either crime removes the doubt and the promise of divine intervention, rendering the entire respective ceremonies useless. The two measurements confront the crimes in different ways. The measurement of the High Court of the Beit Din Hagadol is going to, in chapter 9 by Egla Arufa, discusses, in the case of murder committed beyond the borders of civilization, must assign responsibility to the leadership of a particular community. The suspected adultery, however, in chapter 1 of Masechet Sotah, was conducted within city borders, with witnesses to warning and seclusion. The role of the court is to refer the case to Hashem, to God, who alone administers the measurements, midah keneged midah, justice measure for measure, and will clarify both the level of guilt and the respective punishments. In the case, though, of both chapter 5, the measurements of chapter 5, Mishnah 3, in the middle of the Masechet to find the boundaries of the city, thereby delineating the boundaries, both literal and figurative limits of civilization and human justice, and teach us that sometimes we really do have to leave justice to God, that we can't think as we control a justice system that we really do control. And therefore, the perimeter of the city, the hub of human civilization, has to be measured, has to be limited, has to be put in its place. Now let's take a look at the end of the Masechet at our Perek. Mishnah Vav in Perek Tet requires, therefore, as we see, highlighting the limits of human justice, tells us as well, in addition to the people of the city, the leaders of the city saying, our hands did not spill this blood, they also have to assert, Shelo ba liadinu, upetranuha belo b'mazon, v'lo rianuha v'hinachnu belo levaya, that this person, the victim, didn't come to us, and that we didn't dismiss him without food, nor do we see him and leave him without an escort, teaching us that there are responsibilities for humans, that within our cities, and even within the 2,000 amot beyond the city limits, we're responsible. And after that, then we're no longer responsible. Note then that we find that the city limits discussed both in Perek Hey and in Perek Tet link the measurements of chapter 1, which represent the limits of the human judicial system to resolve a crime of adultery committed within its jurisdiction, with the measurements of chapter 9 representing the return to the city's court of justice for a crime committed beyond its city limits. We're responsible within the city for what happens, and those limitations, though, are going to be manifest also only within the city borders. Here we find then that chapter 9 of Masechet Sotah, through the laws of Egla Arufa, introduces laws of responsibility for murder. And instead of juxtaposing these laws in what we'll call even the Masechtot that generally speak about murder, whether it's Masechet Makot, speaking about Arei Miklat, or Sanhedrin, the punishment for capital crimes, Chazal are teaching us about our limitations and simultaneously bearing responsibility for crimes, both their aftermaths, meaning their punishments, but also what led to this, whether, as we see in Perek Tet, the idea of frivolity, immaturity, negative peer pressure could also lead to those crimes. So now we're going to focus on the last part of the chapter, chapter, the last part of our shiur, focusing on the literary parallels between Egla Arufa Perek Tet of Masechet Sota and the laws of Sota itself. Let's begin with, as we mentioned, the very end of Perek Tet. The Mishnayot end with Misha Rabu Haratchanim Batla Egla Arufa, when there are too many murders and there really is no efficacy to the ceremony of Egla Arufa. No one is really taking responsibility for such crimes. Similarly, when there are too many adulterers, there's no point then for the miraculous divine intervention to clarify, to help us appreciate the divine midah keneged midah, and therefore pasku hamayim hamarim. We have similar terms of od omer, ad omer ra'iti, va'ad omer lo ra'iti, ad omer nitmeti, ad omer lo nitmeti. What do we do until certain issues with regard to the ceremony are clarified? The Beit Din Hagadol Yerushalayim, we already mentioned. What do we do until the ceremony is actually enacted? The crimes leading to the actual murder, or also the stages leading to the woman being brought to Yerushalayim. We have two Talmidei Chachamim accompanying her. Ad shalom ne'erfa ha'egla. What do we do until the egla, until this heifer is actually going to have its neck split? And then what can no longer be done after that happens? Similarly, until what stage can the woman confess to her crime of adultery? Ad shelo nimchaka hamegillah, until the parshiah that is going to be written is not completely erased by the waters, then she still has an opportunity for confession. We hear about, in the case of all the epilogue of Mishnayot of the Egla Arufa, talking about what would happen during the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, of the lack of drinking wine. And speaking of wine, harbe yayin, oseh harbe schok, that wine leads to frivolity. So we have another parallel here. On one hand, wine can be used as a beautiful expression of our happiness. On the other hand, wine can also lead to promiscuity. And therefore, we have more parallels, the parallels of the measurements of the corpse from his head, his entire torso, his midline, the eyes, similarly describing the entire anatomy of the female, and how both her sin and her punishment are going to reflect one another. How just as she started her sin with her thigh and then her stomach, so too the punishment will come from the thigh and then the stomach. She made her hair beautiful for her adulterer. Her hair is going to be either uncovered or made ugly. Then we already discussed the parallels of modadin, of measurements, the involvement of Ruach HaKodesh, the divine spirit, the idea both of a talui bi'ilan, one who is caught in the thicket of a tree, and similarly Avshalom, whose hair was caught in the terebinth, in the thicket of the tree, midah keneged midah, for showing off his hair. And similarly, Shimshon, who went after his eyes, whose eyes are going to be taken out. And the victim who may be found even over the waters, versus Miriam, midah keneged midah, who waited for Moshe by the waters, and Yosef rewarded for his acts as well. So we see various literary terminology as well. And the point of all this is, once again, to associate our perek, the chapter, the final chapter of Isha Sota, the chapter dealing with murder, to ideas of adultery of the Isha Sota, teaching us that these are the greatest threats to civilization. Adultery undermines marriage, which Rav Soloveitchik beautifully explains as the microcosm of a community, of a society. A murder, literally killing of one another, definitely undermines civilization. We see this beautifully expressed in the Torah as well. Devarim Perek Chafbet equates rape, for example, with murder. Ki kasher yakum isha re'ehu uritzacho nefesh kein hadavar hazeh. Or if we open up Sefer Vayikra, talking about how to build a society of Kedusha, first we hear about all the different promiscuous relations, incestual relations that we have to stay away from, including adultery. And there the Torah ends this thing as Ki et kol hatoivot ha'ela asu anshe haaretz asher lefnechem v'titzma haaretz. These are the actions that defiled the land by the civilizations that preceded you in the land of Israel. And therefore we're warned from perpetuating such a disgusting act, such as adultery. Similarly, in Bamidbar Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Lamed Daled, describing then the conclusion even of cases of accidental murder, of a Rotzeach B'Shogeg in Eretz Yisrael, we hear that murder does what? Below titma ta'aretz asher atem shochneim ba, you're going into this land because do not defile through murder. Do not defile this land. Asher ani shochen betocha, ki ani Hashem shochen betoch bnei Yisrael. It's not just about the civilization that has to remain pristine and viable in order to thrive in the land of Israel. Do not just defile the people themselves, but recognize that whether it's adultery or murder, it also defiles the land because it's the land in which the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is going to be manifest as well. We see one last theme, and that is, especially speaking on behalf of the Eden Center, the theme of the waters. Whether it's the Isha Sota, Vihishkat Haishat, Me, Hamarim, Hama'ararim, and what happens with these waters that are considered not only bitter, but cursed waters. Uba'uva, Hamayim Hamarim, Limarim, Vihishka et Hamayim, Uba'uva, Hamayim Hamarim. And if in fact, she drinks these waters come inside of her. It doesn't just say she drinks them. Uva uva. The Kohen has her drink it and it enters her very essence. Va'uva hamayim, arim, lamarim. And they become bitter inside of her. They're transformed inside of her body. V'im lo nitzma'a, so much so that if she really was not defiled, if she was suspected of adultery but never really committed the crime, then ha'isha, im lo nitzma'a ha'isha, v'tohurahi v'nikta, then she is absolved of any crime and suspicion. V'nizra hazera. And then, in fact, as Chazal teach us, she's actually rewarded with the possibility of conception and with the conception of a beautiful child, a healthy child. Somehow these waters actually transform her very being. Similarly, in Perek Tet, discussing the laws of the Egla Arufa, the ceremony that the elders of a city have to perform in order to show responsibility for murder that they may not even be guilty of, but nonetheless take responsibility for the crime. Whoever is closest then to the corpse, what do? They have to place their hands, the same hands that could have or definitely express responsibility for murdering another human being. They place those hands inside the nachal, inside the stream, the waters. Va'anu va'amru yadenu lo shavchu et hadam hazeh v'einenu lo ra'u. They're absolved of the crime when they recognize that their hands do not bear responsibility for murder. The waters, as we see, can serve then, both in the case of Isha Sota and in the case of Egla Arufa, as punishment or absolution. And therefore, on behalf of the Eden Center, which promotes the teaching and the practice of the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha, family purity law, which focuses on enabling women to have a personal, meaningful, and welcoming experience in the mikvah, we learn from these Mishnayot how waters, the Mei Marim HaMarim of Mesechet Sota, the Isha Sota, the Nachalitan of Perek Tet of the Egla Rufa, and the mikvah may transform, may purify, and certainly promote religious and physical well-being and greater intimacy, ben ish li'ishto, ben adam l'chavero in Perek Tet, and also ben adam l'makom. May we merit the fulfillment, or I should say really the reversal of what we find at the end of chapter 9, recognizing all those minhagim, beautiful customs that were taken away with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, with the breakdown of society and the breakdown of marriages. May we merit the building and rebuilding of families, of homes, of happy and healthy marriages described at the end of the Masechet, manifest through the beautiful customs of the marriage ceremony, from the crowns that were worn by the Chatan and the Kala, May we celebrate these both as a means and as an end, to celebrate the rebuilding of Hashem's home and the restoration of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that one day will be manifest again through the building of a binyan ad, and as we see at the very end of Perek Tet, with the restoration of Tchiyat HaMetim, the revival of the dead, b'mheira b'yamino. Amen.